a speaker on that might help. There we go. Wednesday, the 21st of. Yeah, I did. Try again. Hi, call to order the meeting? Yes. Call to order the. I'll have to work on my hitting arm. Call to order this policy committee meeting of Wednesday, the 21st of September 2022. The TNRD acknowledges we connect with many First Nation communities across our vast regional district. Today, we are located on the Tecumseh territory, situated within the unceded ancestral lands of the Secwepemc Nation. The TNRD appreciates the partnership that we have with Tecumseh and respect the territory and land on which we gather today. Are there any additions to or deletions from the agenda? Seeing none. All right, we move on to the minutes. We have the May 18th. Cast your mind back to May 18th.
Don't move. Thank you.
Are there any errors or omissions? Seeing and hearing none on the question, all those in favor, that is carried. We move right along to item number 5.1, Policy and Governance Committee Terms of Reference. We have a report from the General Manager of Corporate and Legislative Services.
Thank you, Chair Roden. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation for the committee. We'd just really like to get the committee's input and feedback on this proposed new draft terms of reference. So it has expanded the scope of the policy review committee to include governance. So it's newly renamed Policy and Governance Committee. So just looking for any input, feedback, any additional items that the committee feels would fall under this updated mandate.
Thank you. Comments, Director Rothenberger.
Just a question. I'm just curious, is this addition to the policy committee a result of BDO Dunwoody, or is it just part of the overall committee review?
No, I would say this is mainly as a result of the committee review. In reviewing other local governments, mainly regional districts committees, we found it really interesting that there were a few regional districts and a couple of municipalities that had recently created governance committees, and they often combined it with either policy or sometimes governance and ethics. And we just felt that this might be an opportunity to expand the role of the policy committee to include governance. We've also done a number of initiatives lately that I would say fall into the sort of realm of governance. So our communications initiative, so trying to increase our public engagement, things like that. And we felt that it would really be beneficial to bring those items to a committee to get input and feedback and other ideas.
So previously, those kinds of things would have just come up scattered among various committees through committee of the whole, et cetera, and it's just a way of focusing the job. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
All right, looking at the policy, the terms of reference, does anyone have any specific comments, suggestions, additions, amendments? Director Brown?
I just want to say this is looking good. It's clean, it's clear, it's and we're looking at all our terms of appointment to be into a 2-year period. So we actually get time to discuss before we actually have to run another election. Thank you. That's the word. So yeah, I like it.
Thank you. So, and this is being done for all the committees, and all the committees will have 2-year terms, correct?
That's correct.
Are there any other comments? Director Stamer?
Thank you, Chair Roden. On the membership end of things, when it says the committee shall consist of 9 members, is that every committee or is it just this one specifically?
That's just specific to this committee.
And our large communities are Merritt and Kamloops.
One more on the purchasing limit for CAO and CFO, 250,000. It's saying it remains as what we had before. Is that consistent with other regional districts? Do we know that?
I don't,
It just seems high.
we're not there yet, Director Brown. That's the next item.
Okay. I'll take that back until the next meeting. I mean, the next, never mind.
We can tell what you're eager to get on to. All right, so move the recommendation. Do we have a seconder? Second, Director Schaefer, thank you. Any further comments? Director Rothenberger?
Just a question again on the membership, the three large municipalities, you mentioned two of them. What's the other one? Merritt and Kamloops. But there's three listed or stated here. There's going to be three large municipalities.
I think directors from three large municipalities, so that could be one Merritt and two Kamloops, or it
Oh,
could be
yes,
three
exactly.
Kamloops.
Yeah,
People.
Oh, okay. I was just gonna make the point, as I like to do, that Area P is larger than almost every municipality in the, and should have special status.
that's correct.
Right. No further.
Thank you, Chair Roden. Should we, when it says three large municipalities, should we identify those? Like if we're gonna be talking about mayor and council, shouldn't we identify those two? So there isn't any, no?
I
Are
think
we just
the,
gonna allow it that the flexibility? I mean, no, seriously, why are we, what is the distinction, what's distinguishing between a large and a small municipality?
so that might be a question for the board, because that's how our policy, our committees have always been set up. There's always been representation from the electoral areas, and then what was termed the smaller municipalities and the larger municipalities. So I think the intent here was just to have equal representation from electoral areas, larger municipalities, of which there are two, and then equal representation of three. So it could be two from, well, I guess it would only be one from the city of Merritt, potentially two from the city of Kamloops.
Can we just say over a population of a certain amount, so that would include those two? Wouldn't that just clarify what that's all about? So we could include whatever merits population or close to it and just say large municipalities over a certain population? Wouldn't that clarify it? I'm not trying to be picky. I'm just wondering if somebody else asked the same question. Who's the large municipality? Well, if it's specifically says over a certain population, there's only two. Does that make sense? And then as we go through anything else that's in any other committees or anything else, it would be the same thing. Over a certain population. Well, who has a certain population? Merritt and Council.
All right, I have Director Rothenberger and Director Quinn.
Except that wouldn't you have to be amending the bylaw from time to time to update the population threshold?
You could.
But you could just say the three largest municipalities with the largest population, couldn't you?
If I get a rebuttal, I think we're trying to clean up a lot of this stuff. So what makes the most sense? If we want to identify overpopulation, or do we want to just talk by population?
Okay, Director Quinn.
Thank you. I would prefer to leave it the way it is. And when the chair goes when the chair goes to make his or her appointments, and it's up to the directors to lobby to be on the various committees as the chair goes out. I'm just a little concerned if you try to base everything on population. The tendency might be to shut the very small areas out. And that concerns me, because we're supposed to all be part of one. And that's why I'm comfortable with that. I can't see any sensible chair appointing three people from Kamloops and none from Merritt. That's just my point. So I would prefer to leave it the way it is. Thank you.
Director Brown and then Director Schaefer.
I would also like to leave it the way it is. I mean, perhaps Merritt doesn't want to do that particular thing for that particular term. So leaving it this way just gives us more flexibility.
And Director Schaefer?
The three largest municipalities, would Chase not be one of them? I don't know how many people Chase has. I like the idea of a population base though.
Perhaps this is something that could be dealt with at the TNRD, excuse me, the orientation session. Would you just be explaining to the board after the inaugural meeting or before, whenever it's going to be, that for the purposes of the TNRD and our committees, that larger municipalities are at this moment in time, Merritt and Kamloops. And then that saves having to rewrite every single term of reference for every committee.
Don't know the population, but how much is Merritt more of a population than Barrier, Clearwater, Ashcroft? Like, is it substantially
You
double?
want the pre-flood figures or the post-flood figures?
It's double.
We're somewhere around 7,000, 7,500, somewhere in there.
Ashcroft is 1,700, Cache Creek is 1,000, Clinton is 900. Barrier in Clearwater, 2,500-ish. Pardon me? Any further discussion, comments? We do have a motion on the floor, which is the staff recommendation. Seeing no further hands on the question, all those in favor? That is carried. Moving right along to our second item, and we only have two, so we should be done by 10:30. That's awesome. I will have my little joke. We move on now to item 5.2, new procurement policy. We have a report from the General Manager of Corporate and Legislative Services. It looks like we do have a PowerPoint now.
Hey, thank you. So this is the long-awaited procurement policy. This has been in the works probably for the last 2.5 years. So staff are really excited to finally have a draft in place and be moving this forward and having the opportunity to run this by the Policy and Governance Committee. So while the Delegation of Authority bylaw isn't on the agenda for this committee to review, it will be going to the board at the October meeting. It is tied to the procurement policy, so I just wanted to do a high level overview of that bylaw. So just for a bit of background, as the committee may be aware, previously we had a delegation bylaw, which contained a number of provisions that delegated authority to various staff members on various agreements. And then in addition to that, there was 2 schedules attached to the bylaw, which contained the TNRD's basically procurement practices. So we have now separated that out. And this is common among all local governments where there's a separate delegation of authority bylaw. And then the TNRD will hopefully by the end of this board's term, have a new separate procurement policy. So for the delegation of authority bylaw, just briefly, as per the Local Government Act, the board can delegate by bylaw a number of matters, including the delegation of approval and signing authority to specific persons. Delegation streamlines approval and signing processes and creates greater efficiency for the execution of agreements. In terms of key changes that are now in the delegation of authority bylaw, significant update to definitions. There's been an increase in delegation, greater clarity, much greater efficiency in approvals and signing. There's been new sections added in to provide just to bridge some gaps that we had in the previous bylaw. And significantly, the removal of procurement and purchasing, which is now contained in a separate procurement policy. And removal of the requirement that all agreements with financial implications must be reviewed by the finance department prior to execution. Department heads now and managers will have to take more ownership and accountability for their agreements, and they manage their own budgets. And so it's not the correct process to have the finance department review every agreement that has a financial implication. And then contract procedures were somewhat addressed in the previous bylaw, and those have now been removed and will be added to a separate contract management resource guide. So in terms of the draft procurement policy background, so a lot of research and review went into the new procurement policy. It was guided by the New West Partnership Trade Agreement, best practices in public procurement, a review of other local government procurement policies, and we focused mainly on policies that had recently been put in place, because there are a number of local governments that also have outdated procurement policies. So we focused on newer ones, guidance from other local government procurement resources. The TNRD does not have a procurement resource or staff here, so we're really fortunate that we can reach out to other local governments that do. Feedback and input from staff over the years, myself as well as Doug have been gathering feedback from staff over the years on our procurement practices. Advice from the Auditor General for Local Government, which no longer exists, but they have put out a number of resources and studies on public procurement, and as well as relying on the finance department's input and expertise. So in terms of key changes, again, all procurement and purchasing rules are now contained in one procurement policy. We would define it a fairly significant overhaul of previous purchasing and procurement guidelines. There's greater delegated purchasing authority. There's more rules, principles, requirements, and guidance that have been put into the policy. What we hope is greater clarity and direction for staff, and additional provisions have been added in to fill in previous gaps in the process. So in terms of sections, we've added a number of sections, what the policy applies and doesn't apply to. We've included some objectives and principles. And the key objective here is to ensure the procurement function is efficient, accountable, and maximizes best value, and ensure that all goods, services, and construction will be acquired in a competitive, fair, and open manner. The TNRD is committed to accountable and transparent procurement processes and ensuring compliance with the legislation, applicable TNRD bylaws, and applicable trade agreements. This should be what guides all of our procurement practices. And we've added in some key principles that go a bit beyond that of the policy. So in terms of purchasing authority limits, this table here shows what the various purchasing authority limits. So the significant change here is that previously it was a very sort of level, flat delegation of purchasing authority limits between the CFO and the CAO. And so now what we have is we've added in, and general managers had a very, very low threshold. And looking at other procurement policies, that's not common. General managers obviously have significant responsibility for their budgets and have to make purchasing decisions, as do managers and supervisors. And so we've also added in managers and supervisors and given them some spending limits as well. So we have 25,000 for supervisors and the executive assistant, who often does need to make a number of purchases on behalf of the CAO and the board. And then we have managers, general managers, and then the CAO and CFO. And so then anything over 250,000 goes to the board for approval.
Yeah, thanks, Gerald. Probably to Mr. Ray. So can you tell us approximately how much money we're talking about on a yearly basis in these realms? Like how many times, would the CFA and the CFO be having these limits applied? And the same with the general managers. Are we talking $5 million, $3 million? Like how much would we be talking about on a yearly basis?
Yeah, I mean, through the chair, I don't have a precise number, but I would say quite often we end up entering into contracts for a longer term, for like a 5-year term. And so you might have services that we're acquiring that on a yearly basis doesn't, come close to 250,000. But when you add up, 5 years, you're basically saying anything that's going to cost us more than $50,000 a year is going to fall into that realm of 250 or up. We generally have had significant numbers of contracts, even though they're low value, that we're looking to do a 4 or 5 year contract to get some certainty around pricing and having someone in place to perform those services, and B, to reduce the administrative burden of having to go do a procurement process every year or every 2 years. So yeah, I mean, I don't have a number to provide necessarily, but in my opinion, these thresholds will create more efficiency in terms of the who has to be involved at what level, without it becoming overly burdensome.
Thank you. I have Director Schaefer and Director Walsh and Director Brown. Did you want to put your query in here as well, since we're talking about the limits?
I would just like to know what the limits used to be. Because I heard 75,000, so I don't know if that was right or not.
Through the chair to Director Schaefer. So previously, managers and supervisors didn't have any delegated spending authority. General managers had up to 25,000 maximum. And the CAO and CFO still had 250,000. So what we had was a process where almost everything was going to the CAO and the CFO. Or if it's above 250,000, the board.
Actually, if I may, looking at the little chart here that's on the former policy, authority to approve, the only person who had authority to approve between 75 and 250,000 was the CAO. The CFO did not have the authority then.
That's right. Thank you for that correction, Chairman.
I would also like to know, will any, when you approve over 250,000, will the board get to know it after? Will there be a?
So we've built into the policy that anything that doesn't go to the board, anything that's below the board's threshold, all those contract approvals, I believe it twice a year, we'll be bringing a report to the board to ensure that the board's made aware of all contract approvals that were approved by other signing authorities.
Director Walsh, then Director Brown.
Yeah, I have troubles with these type of, under the, the quotations of efficiency. Because we don't really, Camel City did the same thing. And you don't realize any real efficiencies internally. I guess there's less work to do, and maybe you don't have to, you avoid hiring somebody but there's a lack, what we don't balance it off to is a lack of oversight. Like Kamloops, is it 750? Like it just keeps moving up, right? It's 750 in Kamloops, right? And I find that there's a disconnect there between the public and and even like for a manager to okay 50,000 or a supervisor 25,000 without getting, having run a small business for about 42 years, you need to have some control, and a general manager usually signs off on it. If you trust your managers and your supervisors, it's not a big, long conversation, right? But you at least have that control. But so releasing that control, those numbers can add up, and they can also, not subject to any scrutiny. There's always conflict of interest. Everybody has biases, whatever, right? That enters into it too. And I see that in Kamloops right now, that we're extending these contracts. I'll use an example as a landscaping contract. They're 5 years, and then once they get into a company, they rarely ever get out, right? Whether it's a legal contract or a landscaping contract, and they're huge dollars. And I disagree with the idea that we're saving money by doing this. Like then going out to the market, because that's how, basically that's how the market works, right? Is you compete. And so once you give somebody a contract, especially if it's a 5-year term, they tend, I've seen it just roll over, right? So I don't know if, the public benefits from these so-called efficiencies, other than losing oversight and control. And like, to me, for a general manager to sign off a supervisor's request for 25,000, it shouldn't, use up a lot of half a day time. It should be like a half an hour discussion and it's over, and it's $25,000. So I disagree with some of these efficiencies. I understand in some cases you need that. the CAO and CFO, I think that's a good improvement that both of those get to sign off on the 250. But it concerns me when this is the trend, is to go to efficiencies and at the cost of oversight or possibly biases and conflicts entering into the situation. So yeah, I guess I'm not in favor of these procurement policies. And I know they call them best practices, but if somebody did a review of these things over the last 10 years, I think it would be questionable if we've actually improved anything. And the prices, the costs could have gone up.
Thank you.
So,
And I know Director Brown still got you on the list and Director Quinn, but okay, so what would?
so is there a problem? Like, I don't see how, like, I know it's efficiency is always a game, right? But is it really been that convoluted and, troubling to have the supervisor to come to the general manager to approve $25,000? Like, is the feedback warranted to make these changes? And I guess that would be a question to the CAO and.
Through the chair to Director Walsh. So I think the attempt here was actually to try and balance, was actually to try and achieve better oversight. So what was happening here is that everything was going to the CAO or the board, right? And so what we're trying to do is empower supervisors and managers. It's part of their role and their job description to have oversight over their budgets and spending, yet they didn't have the ability to do that, right? And so of course there's a certain level of trust that has to come with that. But there's an expectation that if you're hired as a supervisor or a manager, it comes with a significant number of responsibilities and duties and authority, which includes spending authority. So we're trying to actually give them what's been built into their, essentially what's been built into their roles. And in addition to that, we recognize that this is a change. And so we've created this, what we hope is this robust procurement policy for them to follow. And then in addition to that, we're going to be coming up with a procurement guideline document that is very specific and step-by-step for staff. So that'll be at the administrative level. And it'll also be accompanied by significant training. So our hope here is not just to create efficiencies. And I can confidently say, and Mr. Ray or Mr. Hildebrand may weigh in, that I do believe this will create some significant efficiencies, which is important. But in addition to that, we also feel strongly that this is going to create greater oversight and accountability within the organization as well.
Through you, Ms. Chair, I'd also echo Ms. Campbell's comments there too, is we have those conversations that you're referring to. So even though, say, Katie, our executive assistant, can book conferences and hotels that may be up to $25,000, we're always in conversations about those things in our weekly meetings and our bi-weekly meetings. So there's always that consistent feedback and questioning between general managers and supervisors. And I really do feel that there is efficiency in this, because right before it was $25,000 starting at the general manager level or even manager level. And now it balances the entire organization and allows us to get things done more consistently and I think more efficiently.
And if I may, we've also included a greater number of rules in terms of being able to actually execute on this authority and this spending. And most importantly, documentation. So there's a significant requirement now built into this policy in terms of documenting decisions that are made around spending and actual spending. And what we would really like to see happen, and this is one of the recommendations from the former Auditor General from local governments, is have this policy reviewed over time. Let's see if it's working. Has it actually resulted in an increase in efficiencies? Has it resulted in adequate oversight? So we do propose, and I believe I put this in the report, that this policy should be reviewed potentially, every 1 to 2 years. At a maximum, I'd say maybe every 2 years would be a more realistic timeline to sort of see how it gets implemented. So there is an opportunity to revisit this, of course.
Sorry, and the last thing, if I may, just sorry, Doug, just from the developing our staff and our team and making sure that we have people that can, grow in their position and take on bigger and bigger roles to me is all about succession planning. And you need to get people involved in this type of procurement process and leadership, because it helps as they take the next step in their career. And I found that over and over again in my past experience.
Yeah, I echo everything they've said. The other comment I wanted to make is what you're not seeing just looking at this table. Maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves, but there are, just because the general manager would have a purchasing authority of $100,000, there are lower limits being applied in terms of how that procurement has to take place. So there's still going to be very specific requirements laid out in the purchasing policy about when you have to obtain competitive quotes, when you have to go do an RFP or a public tender, and that those are lower thresholds. So, part of your concern, I understand, but understand too that they're not necessarily going to be able to go out for a contract with $100,000 value and just direct award it to somebody. So there will be processes that will be required to follow in terms of how they do the procurement.
Okay, but yeah, in the report, it doesn't, that's not included, right? Like, so, okay, I can understand that you hope you have it nailed down pretty tight, right? So,
I want to add to what our CFO has talked about. We also have a board that produces a strategic plan on a greater basis, but also an annual basis. And we have projects within that strategic plan that managers have put on the priority list, plus the emergency things that come along. These are not limits that are just willy-nilly. They're going to pull something out of the air and spend $100,000 and approve without board approval. We've already approved the project through some kind of process in planning. It enables better evaluations, better conversations with managers and supervisors, and it's more accountable. What it does is stop the bottleneck of having one person review all of these once the invoice comes in. And I want to say too, that if we're going to give managers, supervisors, if we're expecting them to be accountable, they have to have the responsibility in order to be accountable. You can't separate responsibility from accountability and expect great things to happen. They have to go hand in hand. We've got to be able to give managers the ability to do their jobs. And my original question was on the authority limits of 250,000. And especially in terms of the 5-year contract. Are we talking a 5-year contract that equates to 250, or so in the 1 year when you've got 250,000 on a 1-year contract, that's okay. 250 on a 5-year period, 5 years in a row, does that fall under this category, or would that be a higher limit?
It would be higher limit. So it's the total value of the contract. So we moved away from that. So previously we did have this, and it was very complicated.
It was very.
And it was actually pointed out in one of the resources that we had reviewed that is not a good practice to have it. It should just be the total value of a contract, regardless of how many years that contract is.
Good, thank you. I was hoping you'd say that. I'm good with that.
Thank you. With respect to the NWPTA, are those numbers compliant with that? I guess that's to Doug or CAO.
Sure, it's a little separate. The Northwest trade agreement really talks about anything 75,000 and up or 200,000 and up in terms of construction, where it wants you to have an open, transparent public procurement process. So that's the part I was talking about, where we would have, at different dollar values, this is the process you need to follow for procurement. Under 75, we've defined it even more than we had in the past. And over 75, we're still bound to those dollar limits in the trade agreement. That's separate from the approval levels, right? So the fact that a general manager could approve something that's 100,000, he would still be bound to, if it was not construction, to following the right procurement process as laid out in the trade agreement. The other thing where the trade agreement comes into play is in that trade agreement, it lists out a number of exceptions where in the trade agreement, like for instance, if we're purchasing goods or services from another local government, that's an exception that was built into the trade agreement where we're not required to go do an RFP or something. And so if I remember correctly, we've tried to build that into the procurement process so that we're not having to take those things specifically to the board. But again, it still fits into these dollar values.
Okay, thank you. A second question I had is that, are those numbers realistic given inflation? Or perhaps the question should be asked is, have we taken inflation into account?
I don't know if inflation would impact approval levels, it would impact what we're spending. But in terms of whether it informed the amounts that we've allocated spending limits to various staff, I don't think it would have an impact or should have an impact.
It was just a thought that,
Mhm.
because I don't think we're gonna see deflation at all. And so those numbers may be too low, or they may be just right.
Mhm.
But the board does have the ability to go back, say, 6 or 8 months down and review it. Okay, and the last thing I like about this is you're actually giving staff the authority and the accountability to spend this and that, because it's crazy to have the CAO have to authorize a purchase order for pencils. It's just nuts. And so, but in my experience, if people are given the responsibility, they actually rise to the occasion. So I'm comfortable with that. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
I still have problems with it because I mean, I experimented with this and I know it's a different level retail, but like I agree with, I think one of the best improvements you did there is the CAO and the CFO signing off on 250, right? Like, which I would be happy to support this if it said the general manager and the supervisor. Like when there's two people signing off, there's a certain thing, a human condition. We've gone through that with the Tnrd fiasco in the last 2 years, whatever it's been. When you have one person, you have more challenges, let's call it. And so if it was a supervisor and two people, like as we recognize that with the 250, that we want two signees, right? So if I believe there should be, and that's what I experienced in my own business, is if you have two people signing off, there's less likelihood of something going sideways, right? So that's, I commend you for the CAO of CFO on the top, but I think on the bottom, a general manager and a assistant manager signing off, or it just is a double check. And then you don't have to go back in checking everybody, because the efficiency that you're going to gain with this might be lost with following up on the supervisor's $25,000 things, right?
Just clarification, I believe that CAO and CFO means either of those two people can approve 250,000, not that both of them have to.
That's correct.
So it
That's-
should
that's-
perhaps be CAO or.
Sure, yeah. The intent here is not to identify the signing authorities for agreements. It was to identify the spending limits for individual staff members identified up here.
I can understand Director Walsh's concerns. However, we did have previously the conversation around the lack of delegation to people below the CAO and the feeling that this was preventing people from reaching their fullest potential, and there were concerns about succession. So the comments that have been said about giving people more authority and more accountability, I believe, is an answer to that discussion that we have had previously as a board about the fact that people below the CAO did not necessarily have the authority that should have gone with their position. And as a result, everything was getting bottlenecked at the top. And sorry, just before okay, I had a whole flurry of hands go up there. So I had Director Stamer, Brown, Quinn, and Rothenberger. CAO Hildebrand.
Thank you, Chair. I hear Director Walsh and I respect your comments on that. I just feel like the only, I guess, the only comment I would make is if I was the general manager and I'm managing a $4 million budget and one of my managers is spending $50,000, I need to know exactly what that is. And you would see that coming and going. You'd be on top of that. You'd be having those biweekly communications. So it wouldn't be a manager or supervisor spending that kind of money without you being aware of it. So you'd be able to catch that quite easily if you were managing in the appropriate way, would be just a comment I'd share, but I hear what you're saying.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yeah, and again, I mean, it already talks about it. I mean, the proof will be in the pudding in the purchasing policy, but I mean, it already talks about while the procurement rules do not apply to purchases under 75K, best practices, public procurement should still be followed. The policy now provides detailed direction with respects to processes with threshold and required documentation. So obviously, we're already going to have the checks and balances in there as well. I don't understand why, you know, we have to go around and round about this. I mean, it may only make sense that if you're responsible, and as Chair Hillebrand or CEO Hillebrand has mentioned, I mean, if that's what your you know, your budget is 3 million or 4 million or whatever, you're still going to be following the guidelines. You're still going to be following the budget, and they're still going to be fine. It'll probably be easier for us if somewhere along the line we have questions. It's going to be a whole lot easier to find out exactly what's going on going forward than it is right now. And I think that if there was any concerns or if there's something that somebody didn't really like to have a look at, it's going to be brought to our attention a whole lot quicker than it was in the past. Thank you.
And while the CAO or the CFO are signing a $250,000 check, there's backup to that request. They have invoices signed off by the manager. They have work plans signed off, delivery receipts. Every piece along the way has been signed off by some staff member that this has been done. So by the time it gets to the CFO or the CAO, all they're doing is looking through the documentation to make sure that all of that stuff is done. It's not as if they're just signing a blank check. They're looking to see, and it's already documented by those that have gone through that process to begin with. And this is only the spending limit. This is not the process to get there.
Thank you. In the world in general, there's a lot of stuff in the media about not trusting governments. And we certainly were part of it in the first part of this term. One of the ways to start building that is to trust your own people. And by doing these kinds of things, it gives the people the ability to become accountable and to build that trust with everybody. And that's where we have to go. And I think this is the right way to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. I was going to just ask Director Walsh for some clarification, but I think I understand what he's saying now. Is he's concerned about accountability. And I think his suggestion is that two people have to sign off on everything. I don't know if that would include the pencil example or not, or how you would structure that. But on reporting and accountability, I think we have a kind of a new tool there in that just last week or the week before, we received the CFO's report on every check requisition that's been written over a period of time. So it's going to be right there. Sorry about that.
43,000.
So that it's going to be in front of everybody, what's been spent and exactly on what. So that's a big piece of accountability right there, not just for the board, but for the staff who are writing the checks. So I think that's some added protection.
Even sharper.
Sorry.
Going up or down.
If I could just figure out how to mute it, I would.
Okay. So the reporting process will also not indicate just over 250s. It'll indicate
That's
like
correct.
as a CFO report at the end of the year or whatever, you'll see all the expenses go through,
We've been
right?
doing that already.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Well, once a year, you get the formal Sophie report, as has always been required, that lists the vendors who we've paid and the amounts. What we've added is now quarterly reports. that focuses in on the expenditures by the individual board members and senior management. And then that lays out exactly the dollar values of what each of us have been spending. And certainly the other piece of it is the check register monthly. So, and we're posting those publicly on our website. So you're seeing the list of every check that we're cutting, who it's going to, and the dollar amount. And certainly always been open to, if that generates any questions about what it's about, what the purpose is, and so on, we can respond to those questions.
Just a point, we started doing that years ago in Barrier on a monthly basis. And it was interesting that just a few months ago, one of our residents contacted the staff and said, I think there's a mistake on your website. And they asked, what was the mistake? So I think you put a lot of information out there that's not supposed to be public knowledge. And she said, excuse me? And she says, well, you've got all your, your monthly expenses. And she said, no, we've changed that years ago. That's what we do. And that, according to the charter, we're actually supposed to do that. And so they were quite shocked because from the jurisdiction they come from in the past, they didn't do that. So I think just that alone allows our people to see exactly what's going on. And sure, for clarification, you may have to ask some questions, but at least there's your checks and balances the way that it should be. So good that we're doing that now.
Thank you. Before I move on, just to wrap up this slide, in reviewing, we reviewed probably 30 to 35 other procurement policies, and sort of these amounts in comparison to other local governments, I would say they're probably on the low side. And again, that can be revisited in the future. So these are by no means significantly high, as Director Walsh may know from his experience elsewhere. But it's really hard to compare and contrast because we have, some regional districts have huge budgets, and so they have higher spending limits for their staff. And so we've tried to sort of find a balance here. And so again, this table can certainly be revisited in the future. So this table outlines the purchasing methods for goods and services and construction. This is primarily guided by the New West Partnership Trade Agreement. I'm just going to say trade agreement because it's a mouthful. So primarily guided by the trade agreement. One of the new things that we've implemented here is that we've actually identified additional methods to use for low value or lower value contracts. So previously, anything under 25,000, our procurement policy was fairly silent on that. You could direct award that. And so what we've built in is other thresholds where, despite the fact that you don't have to follow procurement rules, we would like staff to follow a documented process, even though it's something that's, under $10,000 or, $17,000. And so we've identified, we've labeled low value processes, informal quote processes, a written quote process, which already existed in our procurement practices, and then the formal competitive process is a request for proposals or a tender.
Director Stamer?
All right, thanks, Madam Chair. Just a quick question. How long do we have a limit on for contracts? Do we have like a 5-year limit, or what is the limit on that? Is there a specification on those? I mean, not like maybe a big project that's going to take 7 years to build, but is there somewhere in the language that says you're only able to enter into a contract, whatever those amounts are, and whoever's going to approve it in a certain period of time?
So the legislation sets a limit for most, especially capital projects. So liabilities under agreement means that typically we can only enter into contracts for 5 years. We often build in the option to renew, but a term is typically a 5-year term or less.
All the way down the line.
Yeah. Okay. So sole source direct awards, this was addressed in our previous procurement documents, but we've put a little more rigor around the process. So anything greater than 25,000, less than 75,000, due to the specialized unique nature of the service or goods. This can be the requirement to solicit 3 quotes or 3 proposals, can be waived by the CAO or the CFO, but it does require a sole source justification form. So we have created this new sole source justification form that does need to be completed and signed off. And it does need to meet one of the requirements that's identified in the form. And then anything over 75,000 or over 200,000 for construction, and this is in the trade agreement, so this follows the trade agreement, may be exempt from public procurement if it meets one of the exemptions that's identified in the trade agreement. And again, it would also need to be accompanied by this sole source justification form that would need to be completed and signed off on. And then, of course, approval requirements for any sole source direct award needs to fall within the purchasing authority limits that you saw in the earlier chart.
Just a question on the terminology. Is it New West or Northwest?
Maybe it's, that's why I want to call it a trade. Is it Northwest or New West?
It's New West.
New West.
It is
yeah.
New West?
I've probably been saying north sometimes and new, because it used to be.
I think there was an older trade agreement
Yes.
that this superseded, and
Yeah.
therefore it was the new trade agreement.
That's right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Thank you.
So if you see, if I put north anywhere by accident, I'll correct it. Yeah, that's probably why I say it sometimes. Any questions about this? Okay, no? Great. Oh, is that it? Oh, that's it. That's the high level overview of the procurement policy. And then we also, and I don't think I have the slides in here, but we did build in some sections around contract administration. So just providing a little bit of guidance on the process for when there's an amendment to a contract. We also, this is fairly new, and this seems to be common in other local government procurement policies, addressing scope changes. This is contract amendments and scope changes are probably the #1 question that my department, as well as Doug's department, gets. And our previous delegation bylaw and the procurement documents didn't really address this. And so now we've formalized those processes into the procurement policy.
Thank you. I had Director Stamer and then Director Walsh.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So when are we gonna see the purchasing policy?
So this is the purchasing.
This
Yeah.
is it?
Yes, it addresses procurement and purchasing.
Oh.
And it does make reference to, we will have a purchase order policy, which is an administrative policy, which doesn't need to go to the board. However, we are committed to bringing it to this policy, the Policy and Governance Committee, for your information, because it does align with the procurement policy. In addition, we're also working on, because you'll see in this draft procurement policy that we make reference to a new purchase order policy, which Mr. Ray's team is working on, as well as a new purchase card, formerly known as corporate credit card policy. So this policy will make reference to those two policies, both of which are administrative policies. However, in the interest of transparency and accountability, we want to bring those policies to this committee for information, so that you're aware of how it aligns with the procurement policy, and changes being made to those two policies would also stem from some of the BDO recommendations, as well as input and feedback that we've heard from staff and board members over the years.
Yeah, I guess this could affect sole source or RFPs, but since 2008, when I've been on council, I've seen kind of an erosion of price being a major influencer on a bidding contract. I don't know what Tnrd does, but I've seen it as low as 20% in the scorecard, as a value. And I've never agreed with that. Obviously, it just doesn't make sense to me that price would be so minuscule as a factor of who you're going to choose. And it opens it up for other considerations, which I find could be the wrong influence, let's call it. So what would the Tnrd, like, do you have a limit as to what, when you do an RFP or a sole source, that it's at least you're going with not the highest bidder, but you're saying at least the bidding price qualifies for 50% of the points towards awarding the contract? Or is Tnrd down to 20 points? Like, because that concerns me, that to me, price should always be a factor, and there's enough room in there at 50% on the qualifications and the quality of work, et cetera, should be able to tip that.
I would say from what I've seen, so all of our evaluation matrices are different for various projects. And so one of the things that we actually will be working on, and I think I identified this in the report, is we will be putting together new procurement documents, so templates, so new RFP templates, and also some guidance around evaluating proposals and sort of what the best practices and guidelines should be around that. But so the general rule is that if price is your focus, then it shouldn't be an RFP, it should be a tender, right? If price is the lowest price, is that's what you're looking for, it should be a tender. And so for an RFP, it's encouraged that price not be the primary factor that you're evaluating a proposal on, but it's certainly important. And from what I've seen, and I haven't been on that many like evaluation teams evaluating proposals, but from what I've seen, we do include price as a fairly significant high factor. I know Mr. Ray might have seen more evaluation materials than I have for proposals, but from what I've seen, we do. I don't think we have a threshold, but I do feel that price is usually fairly significant in our evaluations.
Yeah, I would agree with those statements. Generally, when I've seen the matrix of how we're evaluating RFPs, price is a significant component. It often, has to be balanced. Sometimes it depends on what we're getting, right? Like, and how complicated it is. Sometimes there's very few people who can even quote on it, and you're really looking at, in combination with price, trying to evaluate their qualifications to do the work. And so that can become quite a complex analysis around, whether we're going to get what we're looking for. And especially I found with, and this is by no means a broad sweeping statement, but in my experience, if we're always just looking for the lowest price, we're often going to get, what we pay for.
Okay, just to follow up, like, I just think like the board should say, okay, price should be a factor, but it should never go below 40 points on the scorecard. Like if it goes to 20, because I just experience with the human condition is that if you really want a certain company to, like there's so many other factors that you can use to grade them, right? But if it goes at 20%, then price is almost not even on the board. It doesn't matter what the price is, because to me, I think there should be a limit to 45, 40, not 20%, because then you're getting basically whoever you want, because the price isn't a factor anymore. I just have concerns about that low. I've never, and being in my own businesses for so long, price is a factor in small business, but in politics and corporations, sometimes it's not.
Yeah, and I can say that in any of the matrices that I've looked at, it's never been as low as 20%. Whether it's always 50% or above, I can't say for certain.
Well, even 40, yeah.
Even 40
Yeah.
Would be, what I would be used to seeing.
Yeah, okay.
So I haven't seen it as low as something like 20%. I agree with you. Then I might start looking at it and going, well, you're really just trying to fit the RFP to, get the one proponent that you're looking for, right?
Yeah.
It may be a manipulative way of the process, but I agree with what Ms. Campbell is saying. Part of the process we're going through here is to update some of those templates and the guidance and so on in terms of how we do these things. So, we're getting those things through best practices and also, in the case of procurement, we've got other procurement professionals not working for the Tnrd, but that we can get in touch with and get some best practices from them. Some of the templates, we're looking for legal firms to make sure that all of the required documentation is in the contract template. So we're trying to do our due diligence to make sure that the tools we have to work with won't allow that kind of thing to happen.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a quick comment. I've never seen anything less than 40% here or in my experience in Merit, or even thinking back in the city of Brandon, I can't think of anything, because I would agree that 40% would be kind of that threshold. And something that we can take back and really maybe build into our guidance. So we'll certainly take that under advisement and see if we can come up with something that makes sense.
I don't know if I have a question, a comment. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to, contract amendments. Variance is up to $100,000. Now, if the contract is only 250, $100,000 seems like a huge variance to me. But if the contract is 2 million, maybe 100,000 isn't that much. Is there any recognition for the size of the contract as to what we're looking at in terms of variances? And at what point do you take it back to the board, either for a report or a request to increase? And does this cover any of that?
I'll jump in and start as Ms. Campbell's just checking up on this, but if I had a $250,000 project and it was going to bump to 350, the first thing I would do is bring it back to the board. I mean, that's just how I've always done things, and I think that's the right way to do it. I'm just not sure if we built that in. So Ms. Campbell's just checking that.
So yes, looking at the policy, so yeah, contract amendments for variance amounts up to 100,000, subject to availability within the board approved budget, approved by the general manager. We haven't built in whether $100,000 compared to like a $250,000 contract or a $2 million contract. I mean, it's something that we certainly could
So think of
could
a
look at.
percentage.
Change
of-
greater than a percentage might be worth it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Mr. Ray, I think we did see that in some other procurement policies where there was a percentage put in, so that's certainly something that we could look at building in.
Thank you.
Would you have a recommendation on what that percent
Well, I'm
change
just
through?
thinking, I guess it depends on the project, but there are some projects that 10 to 15% over is significant, and others where it isn't, but there's got to be a number somehow as a percentage, not just a dollar value. And my guess would be somewhere around 10, 15, it should come back for review.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. A couple of quick ones if I could. When we talk about the sole source justification form, I guess this also goes to the CAO is under, it's saying that 250,000 has to be approved by the board for that. And then it says here, emergency purchases go through the CAO. Do you think, I mean, we're all talking about accountability. Do you think that at this stage of the game, there should be an extra check in that in as much as that somebody else should sign off on that direct sole source justification? And if not, where does that get triggered? So that if I'm a manager and I'm under 100K and I do a sole source, how does that get triggered? Whether it's a review or, you know, how does that get looked at?
I'll share my experience maybe to start. Let's separate the emergency part. I mean, I've gotten emails or texts on the weekend where a generator's down in Blue River and we need to spend $5,000 on something that, you know, it's done, right? We have to do that. Yeah, it's
Yeah, but do you believe that you need, like, I mean, we're talking about accountability here.
Yeah.
Do you think that we need an additional safeguard right now for that, in as much as that, would you want to have, I'm just going to ask you straight out, would you want to have that control on the sole source in that period, in this period of time where if a manager wanted to do a sole source, they'd still have to get your approval? And because we know that there's a reason why we went to sole source, because of the finding out it has to meet one of the requirements, whether it's not 3 bids or, you know,
Right.
whatever that is. Is that something that you would want right now, or is it something you'll think is necessary?
in general, I'm always uncomfortable with sole source, like just seeing that once in a while, and you get concerned. It's a bit red flag automatically. But then there's some situations that I've experienced now with the Tnrd where you're building something up in the middle of nowhere where you're not getting anybody to bid on it, or cost of goods might cost more, or there might be a specialization in something where it makes sense. And I think that's where this form comes in. So to your question, then having somebody else verify it, do you have a suggestion on who or how?
Well, I'm just thinking, you're saying 75,000, so I'm wondering, maybe do we want to drop that number down? Yeah, you could, for some of the smaller things, they still have that flexibility because of it's a sole source. Do we want to drop it down from 75K? Because that's where the threshold is, right?
The only thing I'm concerned about is then if it's a multiple year contract or something, because then now we're getting to a small amount over 5 years, right?
Just the reason I brought it up, I don't know what the rest of the members wanted to know about this, because that's sort of the one thing that could be kind of, I'm not going to say loosey-goosey, because you still have all the other requirements in play to be able to make this happen. I'm just asking, do you think it's necessary? Do you think that we've got enough checks and balances that that's really not needed?
So to answer that question, I'd say yes, I'm comfortable moving forward with the process we have now. I wouldn't have been in the past.
I was gonna say, if one manager continues to go over and needs a sole source on a regular basis, it's up to the manager of that individual to pull him in and get him to do things differently. So I think it can be done through evaluations rather than through lowering the limit.
And I just to add some comments, if I may, on that. We often find, thankfully, that staff do reach out to us when they have questions about direct award and whether they can or they can't, or in what circumstances can they. So that's really positive. But I think that we will include that in the training that we're going to be doing when we roll out this policy, is to ensure that staff understand the limited circumstances in which a contract can be directly awarded.
Just while we're here, the editor in me needs to note that on page 31, 4.5, the board hereby delegates to the designed staff member should be designated staff member.
Good catch. We've looked at this so many times and multiple people have reviewed it and no one caught that.
That's where they get through. They're sneaky little devils.
Sorry, just one final comment. It feels like we're getting towards the end of the conversation, but I just wanted to, this is something that my very first conversation before I even walked in the door here was with Mr. Randy Deal about how our procurement policy and some of our delegation of authorities needs to be looked at, needs to be changed. And his exact comment is he didn't want to do it. So he's just passing it along to me. So it's something that we take really seriously. It's something that we started thinking back about and getting feedback about over the last 2.5 years. I know Ms. Campbell's worked very hard on this. I know the input and the help from Doug and the finance team also, and I'm proud of the way that this has come together. It's a huge change, significant change from what we had. And I just wanted to share those thoughts with this committee, because I think it's a step in the right direction.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I think this has been a really good discussion. I don't know, I don't want to add a bunch more stuff here, but when looking at the sole source justification form, as a CAO, would you want to be notified when that happens? So if I'm a manager and I have to do a sole source justification and I'm going to be authorizing and I'm doing a signature, should there be a CC to you? I'm just wondering if we should do that. So it doesn't matter what it is, if there's a sole source, CC goes to you, so that then you would know immediately and I mean, it might only be for 10,000, or it might be close to one of those thresholds.
Yeah.
Is that something that we should
I'd be
do?
comfortable with that awareness. It's not something that,
No.
but I'd be happy with that. But at the same time, I trust my senior management team, and I'm building towards having the best senior management team we can have, and watching over their shoulders certainly isn't what type of manager I am. But I think it would make sense to just be aware of it, flagged for me somehow.
Well, and I appreciate your candor. I think what it would also show to the board is that would also show the staff that we're watching. And that if, we understand their responsibilities, we trust you in doing, not you, but the group as a whole, but this is part of the process. And we want to make sure that if there is something like this, that it gets flagged and that it's brought to everyone's attention. In most cases, there's a perfectly good explanation, but there may not be. And then at least that would alleviate any concerns that anybody would have.
And Director Sam, we could actually build that into the instructions with the procurement guideline document that we're drafting for staff. So I think that'd be a great place to put that in there.
I'll move the recommendation.
I just want to say this is a huge improvement over what we had previously, and it may not be perfect, but we'll get there eventually. And this is again, a huge improvement. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to wish Director Walsh a happy birthday today. And I even know how old he is, but things get sensitive when you get that old, so I'll leave it to him.
68.
Speaker, which Deanna, I'll tell you, the 6.025, can I talk about that? Adding an extra member to TNRD. Okay, yeah, and it's not anything on the TNRD, but I think given we're the Policy Governance Committee, because we've reached a threshold in Kamloops as 6.025, the government, in their wisdom and in politics, as a strange beast it is, has said you round up. So that opens the door for us to have 7 members of city council on TNRD, which we're already at 25%, which I think is more than enough. We could probably cut back from that, but let's say we leave it at that. But to add another member when you're at 0.025, I can see if you're at 6.55, maybe you could, like an election or whatever. But can we appeal to the, to legislation to the province, or do we have an option to not accept 7? Or is it just we have to have 7 people now?
For the chair to Director Walsh, I can comment on this. So we have been in discussions with the ministry, and so you are correct. After the October election, based on the letters patent, the city of Kamloops would be appointing 7 members to our board. We've reached out to the ministry to find out what is the process to amend our letters patent. So the alternative is to amend our letters patent so that we reassign the number of votes that the current existing 6 have. That process is extremely involved. I would say it could take up to a year. There's First Nations consultation involved. And so we had asked, if we start this process now, is it possible for us to just hold off on having the city of Kamloops appoint a 7th councillor? And the response to that was the city of Kamloops would be put in a position where they'd have to explain to their electorate why they're not sending the full complement of representatives on the board. So the city of Kamloops absolutely may opt to not appoint a 7th councillor. But my sense from the response was that the city of Kamloops council may be put in a difficult position of explaining why you're not sending the full number of representatives and votes to the TNRD Regional District Board.
Common
So,
sense, is that a good explanation?
so
But-
this is
I mean, there's an expense of 18,000 to the taxpayers, at least at this rate, right? Like it just doesn't, I don't see it's necessary in that 0.025 to trigger a person. I mean, logic doesn't fit in this situation for me.
this may be something you would like to address with.
So
with
if I was on
with your
council, I would defend the decision of not putting an extra person on, but I'm not going to be on council. So I just was curious if it was a mandatory that we have to go to that, but you say there's some problem.
So the legislation says that the city, that our member municipalities must make appointments to the regional district board, and those appointments are based on the population numbers.
Can we appoint somebody from First Nations? Does it have to be a counselor?
No, yeah, unfortunately, the legislation doesn't allow for that at the moment.
Okay, it just seems ludicrous in the sense of that, that little 0.025 triggers the expense to taxpayers. Okay,
Just to jump in on that conversation, I would agree with you fully. I mean, logistically, I mean, we're gonna put 5 chairs across the top right now, and that's how we're gonna get 27 in here, but financially, it probably doesn't make sense. So it'll be really up to the city of Kamloops, and it'll be up to how, this whole process works out, because it will take us a long time to amend the letters of patent, so.
Well, now I wish I was gonna be here for that discussion when it comes up, because I really hope we don't go there with 7 city directors. There's already too many.
I'll make a motion, we adjourn.